This is Tim, and this is Deconstructing Comics. Welcome to Deconstructing Comics. This is Tim in Tokyo. Just recovering from a cold, as you'll hear in this week's interviews. The topic this week is photo reference. Most artists draw from photos at some point, but sometimes in a way that looks too stiff, or even like a photoshopped fumetti. Other times they'll use it in a way that you wouldn't even guess that reference was used. We'll hear from Buddy Scalera, who has published several books of photos for comics artists to use as reference. What inspired him to put photo reference books together? How did he choose the poses to shoot? And more. Then, Stephen Bissett from the Center for Cartoon Studies in Vermont will be here to talk about how to keep photo reference from looking stiff, potential problems with casting celebrities as your characters, and plenty of examples of the use and misuse of photo reference. And, yes, Sting's name comes up. But first, if you value the content on Deconstructing Comics, Critiquing Comics, and To the Bat Poles, if these shows have helped you get a new perspective on something or to discover something new, help us keep going with a monthly donation via Patreon at patreon.com/deconcomics. If you pledge at least $3 a month, you'll be able to access additional content on Patreon, and we'll include an ad for your comic in the show once a month. If you'd rather send a one-time donation via PayPal, use the email address donate@deconstructingcomics.com. We appreciate your support in keeping the show going. So I'm talking to Buddy Scalera in, New Jersey, is it?
I am in, actually it is very sunny today, so it is sunny New Jersey, yes.
Okay, good. So, yeah, you were on a couple times, I think, but it's been 3 or 4 years ago. And I think one of those times we talked about a different photo book that you had put out. And so now you're, re-releasing a photo reference book that you did a few years back?
Yeah.
Is that right?
Basically, I don't have much to report. You know, there was a book there, and I reached out to the publisher, and I said, remember when we sold this book? And they said, yeah. And I said, we'd sold quite a few issues. And they went, yeah. And I said, it's out of print? And they said, yeah. I said, it's really easy to put books back into print. You don't even have to pay me to create it. And they thought, hey, that's a good idea. So this is a test. I have 5 original published books, and we're experimenting with book number 1 going back into print. It's called People and Poses. It came out maybe 10 years ago, and it at the time when it came out, it was $25, but we dropped the CD-ROM because people's computers don't have CD-ROM drives anymore. And we dropped the price $5 because, if you ever go to a Comic-Con, $20 is a magic number. One bill, you just hand it to somebody. There's no change. There's not a lot of thinking about it. So we got the book to an even $20. We redesigned it. I didn't like the layout and design the first time the book came out. So, yeah, it was a nice opportunity to go back and removing certain things, certain lessons. I didn't want it to be so lessons heavy. I wanted more photo reference, and there was front matter. I took all that out. So we did add a series of never before seen photos, but for the most part, the book is probably about 80% the same.
Okay. Well, what was it that you didn't like about the layout before?
It's funny you ask because, I came out of Wizard magazine, and, Wizard was very innovative with their layouts. So the publisher decided to get really creative with the layout, and over a few pages, it's fine, but every single solitary page, photos were angled 20 degrees, 10 degrees, 30 degrees, 40 degrees. And it's really hard to use a book that's supposed to be essentially a tool, right? It's a reference book with all the photos turned on an angle, right? Because then you have, if you want to see the photo straight, you got to angle the book, which then maybe knocks your sketch pad down, right? So if you've ever used photo reference books, and I use my own books, it was really hard to use them, I felt. And some people said it, but I didn't like all the angles. For me, give me a photo straight up, zoom it in as big as you can, make it as big as you can on the page so I can see the actual anatomy, And that's what we did in this book. So I got a chance to go back and fix that layout.
I see. So when you originally put this out 10 years ago, whatever it was, what inspired you to put it together?
Oh, I was coming out of Wizard and I was just starting to work in comics, and I was noting, I was sitting at a table with Jimmy Palmiotti and Joe Quesada. I was behind the table, and they were talking about moving. I forget, one of them was moving, and they were saying how they were moving all their books and their photo reference books, and I'd never heard the term before. And they explained that photo reference is what artists use as reference for comics and other things, because you can pose in a mirror, you can get your friends to pose, but for speed you might get photo reference books. And they showed me what they looked like. And what was notable was that those books were very expensive at the time. They could exceed over $100, and people would not part with them. Once you had a set, you didn't get rid of it. This is long before the internet, digital type of things. And I thought, well, wouldn't it be great if there was affordable photo reference? So I got my start at Wizard, and I programmed the websites, and I learned code, and that was a real benefit for me. So I did them first on CD-ROM with the goal of creating affordable photo reference. And I priced my first CD-ROM that came out in 2001 for $10. And I thought, for 500 images, $10 felt pretty good, especially as before Google image search and things like that. And it was people, places, and things. And it was a hit, and people liked it. And then I did 2 more CD-ROMs, and then I got approached by a print publisher that said, would you like to do this as a print book? And it got me out of having to worry about self-publishing and mastering and distribution, and then they started to handle it. So it really came out of listening to what artists wanted and needed, and then eventually, as I became a writer and I started writing comics for Marvel, the ability to send somebody a photo of a warehouse or the front of a building was a speed technique, right? You were able to say, this is what I see as this apartment building here. Use that as reference. You don't have to draw it exactly. Or this pose, or this angle, this top-down angle, or this bottom-up angle. Sometimes you could send somebody a photo and go, this is what I see in my head, and then the artist can take it from there. So it was really a utilitarian tool for me, Tim, but I really did want to make sure that it was affordable. And price point is very important, especially for creative people. And I focused on quality the best I could do. I look back at the early photos, and I'm like, okay, I was a novice, and then I got better. But price point was important, and I think that is a hallmark of trying to recognize what your audience needs, and that was how I got started. And then, I did a couple more photo reference books, and then I did a how-to book, creating comics from start to finish, interviewing creators. So it was just on a lark. It was a project. I had free time, and I did it.
I see. Okay, and you took all the photos yourself.
Yeah, I was very fortunate. It was early on, and I scored a digital camera, and I photographed everything. I knew nothing about photography. And the funny thing was, I was using a basic instant camera, and when they had reached out to me, the publisher, they said, when you do this, we know that you're using a basic camera, but you'll use a good quality SLR camera. And I was like, yeah, of course. And they said, you'll do dynamic bracketing, and you increase the ISO, and decrease the ISO, and shoot higher speeds. And I'm like, yeah, no problem. And I had no idea what they were talking about. So I'm on the phone interviewing with the editor, and I'm saying to the woman that I shared an office with, I'm like, Google ISO, what is that? And she goes, you can do it, it's fine. And I got my advance, as book authors know, you get an advance to start your book, and I knew nothing about photography, so with my advance money, I bought a subscription to Popular Photography magazine, I bought a Canon camera, and then sat down and proceeded, page by page, to teach myself how to use a DSLR. And I didn't know anything about it. And I had this woman at work who said, I'll be your model. And we sat down and proceeded to shoot some, I think, 4,000 photos over the course of a day. It was one of the first digital SLRs. I paid a fortune for it. It was a Canon. And we sat together, and we literally had I think a camera card. It was like I think it was a 512 megabyte. So you can imagine shooting 4,000 photos and swapping 512 megabyte cards in and out of a Mac. And we me and the model just figured, we just looked on the screen and we went, okay, we have to do, and we just learned how to use the camera, and that was how I learned it. So the first photo set you'll see, the model who is the brunette girl, Haiti, we learned how to do photography together, and that was it. I mean, I knew nothing about it, but I was determined to learn, and I got a book out, and I got the popular photography magazine subscription, and just learned how to do it.
I see. Yeah, I found her here. She's holding a sword. She's holding a gun. She's wearing a cape.
She was an amazingly patient person. We got in the studio at like 7 a.m. and left at like 9 p.m. and she just modeled all day long.
Wow.
Yeah, she was awesome. She was she was a trooper, and she loved it. We had so much fun. And then I did that whole first book. All of those models were very patient with me. As I said, I've never done photography before. We're going to learn this together. And we're like, great.
Did you have sort of a checklist of like what kinds of poses you wanted, or how did you decide what to do in the photos?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I was probably more then than now. I was very organized, and I sat down and I made stick figure sketches of everything that I wanted to photograph. But most of those were based off of, illustrations by guys like Jerry Ordway and the Ramitas, and I literally looked at comics and I went, okay, how would I photograph that? Like bottom up or top down or, 3/4 turn. And I literally looked at comics and thought, how would I shoot that? And it was a lot of learning about how do you photograph something that is essentially a representation. And, I drew stick figures. So I have a notebook, and I sat down and I went through and I said, I want to photograph, say, somebody thrusting with a sword. And then I would shoot straight on, thrusting with a sword, and then I'd lie down on the mats. We did it at a karate school. I'd lie down on the mats, and then I'd climb up on a ladder and then shoot down. And that literally is how I did it. Every photo you saw was photographed 3 times. Mm-hmm. That was before I learned about speed photography and stuff. So we basically just tried to replicate what comic book poses were. That was in the very first book. And then the second and third books, I got a little bit more courageous, and I started to have people run and jump and roll and do karate in the studio. And then it was more the natural motion of the body. And Sean Chen had noted something, and he has the only really surviving art lesson for this you'll see is by Sean Chen, and he talks about how a body in motion is off balance. Mm-hmm. And it was a great observation by an artist. If you pose somebody who's standing holding a sword, their body mechanics are different than if they're lunging forward, right? They might be standing on the ball of their foot or be somehow off balance. You're off balance when you're in motion. So in the first book, a lot of the stuff was straightforward and more flat-footed, which is more posy. And then by the time I got to the second and third books, it was definitely much more dynamic. And yet, the first book remains my most popular book. People really I think they like the models. I think they like the rawness of it. It's just a very raw, honest book. It was just, me, a couple models, and just trying to figure things out. And I think a lot of artists can relate to that, figuring it out as you go, because you don't always know everything, and especially in comics, we're always trying new things and reinventing the medium, probably more than any other medium.
So I notice, at least now looking at this book, I haven't seen the others in the series, but this People in Poses, a lot of it feels, things that would work really well for like superhero or other action kinds of comics. Have you thought about doing things that would work for other genres? Like I was looking at some Japanese photo books that my kids have here, and for drawing manga, there are so many different genres of story in manga. So there are some sports poses and some things that would work for romance or whatever. Have you thought of doing or done any photo reference for those kinds of stories?
Yeah, I'm actually glad you asked that, because in the book, the one that you're holding, we spend a little bit of time, really basic mundane things that artists have to do, like unscrewing the cap of a bottle of water, drinking from a bottle, or smoking a cigarette. What do the fingers look like? And you can imagine it, but I try to shoot it from an angle that would be tricky for an artist to do. And you're right, you do have to do everyday poses, and you see a lot of that in this book. And then in the second and third books, I definitely get more into it. I actually do show romance. I had a married couple come in, and they ended up smooching for an afternoon. It was a good thing. And I think what I was learning from a lot of the artists who read the first book is they said, "Hey, I need more of this. I need somebody sitting down. I need somebody, in the process of standing up or lifting something." So I really took the feedback of the community and think, just like you just said, like, "Hey, have you thought about this?" And I go, "Sure, let's do it." And I'm that responsive to, and I think that that's one of the things that's special about comics. Like, we can talk to each other as peers with really no barriers, except for the biggest creators, maybe Stan Lee. But for the most part, you can get in front of most of the creators that you admire and get feedback. So I actually did get feedback, and I mentioned Jerry Ordway uses my books, Terry Moore, Greg Horn. They all gave me great feedback of things that they would like to see, as well as up-and-coming creators, and I integrated those into the future books. So yeah, I think people like you observe the kinds of things that you need, and then I would integrate it. So it was very much driven by the wants, needs, and requests of the community.
I see. Yeah. Okay, so this is Comic Artists Essential Photo Reference People and Poses. I'm looking in the back here. I see there's a colossal collection of action poses, men and boys, women and girls, and creating comics from start to finish. Do you have any other books in the pipeline?
No, it's really hard. The internet has made it very, very difficult to be a photographer and produce print materials. And if the publisher sees that this book sells sufficiently enough to justify future books, I definitely would. It's just hard to get people to buy things these days. Mm-hmm. And with the internet, people just Google images. And I get it. I would do the same thing. I think what I do is special, and there are enough creators. Most professional creators don't bat an eye at $20 or $25, but an aspiring creator, an up-and-coming creator, maybe somebody who recently graduated college, that could feel expensive, especially when you can Google stuff for free. Mm-hmm. Plus, piracy has made it incredibly difficult to publish now. I mean, it's just the sad truth is people pirate your stuff like crazy. And that's heartbreaking for creators like me and others who work really hard and try to provide a really good product. And then somebody goes, "Oh, I think I'll just steal that." Or they'll call it sharing because that makes it seem less like stealing. But they wouldn't want their work stolen, but they don't mind stealing someone else's. And I think as an industry, we really need to stand up and educate people and say, look, it worked out okay for music because they have concerts and tours. If you're stealing the only product that I have, it makes it really difficult for me. Like, there's no concert for me, There's no T-shirt, back of the room, swag sales and things like that. There's nothing. It's my product or nothing. And it's tough. And I think as an industry, we need to make sure that we're constantly educating our fans and peers about saying, don't let piracy take a foothold, because you'll never get the toothpaste back into the tube. Mm-hmm. It just won't happen.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you, you said you'd gone to China recently. What did you do in China?
By night I write comics. Mm-hmm. And I actually just had something come out from Marvel recently. I'll tell you about that in a minute. But by day I work as a marketer. And I do quite a bit of marketing speaking. In fact, I'll be in Cleveland in about 3 weeks. And I alternate it. I do Comic-Cons where I do educational classes, and then I do speaking. And a group of Chinese business people wanted to have a conference, and they wanted to bring international speakers. And I was one of, I think, 4 speakers they brought from the United States to come and talk about digital marketing. So I went out there, spoke about digital marketing and actually storytelling. So I bring up comics quite a bit in my marketing day job because I say, like, if you want to talk about visual storytelling, this is what comic book creators do every day. And the web is a visual medium, and you can draw a lot of parallels between comic books and web design. And I've always said that comic books and web design have something in common. It's words and pictures juxtaposed on a page to tell a story and to get a call to action. On the web, the call to action might be a click, and on a comic book, it might be the turn of a page. But ultimately, we're using very similar tools, and I always thought that good comic creators could be very good web designers and vice versa. So I think I'm one of the people out there trying to cross-pollinate. And being in China, I got to go to Shanghai to talk to Chinese business people, and it was really exciting. They were super nice, and it was my first trip, hopefully not my last, to Asia.
I see. Okay, so you weren't selling your book there.
Oh, I wish. I think they would have bought it. No, they were incredibly nice. But yeah, it was very much for my day job, very much about marketing.
Mm-hmm. I see. Okay, so yeah, you said you'd done something for Marvel recently.
Yeah, it was interesting. I have you ever heard of the term custom comics?
Custom comics. Okay, so customized, like it's like exactly the way that you want it, or something.
Well, yeah, it's sort of like it's a marketing function. Often, not always, but it's often a marketing function. And Marvel and DC for years have made comics for Pizza Hut or comics for something else. I made a comic a couple years ago for Spider-Man and the Fantastic Four in a Bubblicious, the bubblegum adventure, right? And then they distribute it, and then they leverage the recognition of the superheroes to get kids to buy gum, vice versa. Time-honored tradition. But this time I got to work on a comic book. I didn't mention by day. I work in marketing, but I used to be a health writer. I used to be, write about consumer health. And I got to work on a comic book called IBD Unmasked, IBD being irritable bowel disease. And it's a health condition, and it was designed to raise awareness of this condition, right? And, males... there's a lot of males in their 20s reading comics, right? It's not a gross generalization to say there's a lot of males in their 20s. We know that there's female readers. We know they're all ages, and that's not to trivialize any of them, but they recognize that males in their 20s also have this wonderful super ability to ignore health conditions, right? If your arm is still on, you can stay at the party, right? Like, people be like, oh, it looks like your arm is hanging off. You're like, nah, man, it's still on there. Like, the bone's sticking out. And you're like, yeah, but I just want one more drink, right? And what they want to do is start to connect with that audience, because sometimes you get symptoms of something and it's nothing. Sometimes a symptom is a symptom. But then sometimes there's symptoms of something and you need to go to a doctor, and a doctor needs to get you into treatment. And getting early treatment and getting consistent treatment and staying on treatment is incredibly important. And once again, you can do this in a very didactic, straightforward, you must do this or you will, pick your malady, you'll get sicker, you'll die, these things. Or you can wrap it in a story, and a story resonates. And storytelling stays with us longer. So they recognize that with IBD Unmasked, by wrapping things in a story, they're going to connect with an audience and hopefully educate them, motivate them, engage with them to deal with their IBD and not ignore it. Because like all health conditions, Tim, if you let them go, they get worse, right? So early treatment's important in almost every health condition. And I think this is I'm excited about it because it helps people, and they have a great web presence. It's called ibdunmasked.com. And for every view of the web comic they're going to donate money to IBD. I think it's research or communities. I would have to check again. But the great thing is they're putting money into it. They're contributing to the community, and I'm excited to be part of it. And it actually gets my hand back in Marvel. I haven't done any Marvel work in a long time. So yeah, that was a terrible way to end a story. I'm like, and then we rescued penguins from a fire and saved small children. That's how that story really ended.
I see. Okay. All right. Well, speaking of health conditions, I'm going to go to a doctor and have my throat looked at. But thanks very much for coming on and talking about.
Well, feel better. I hope you take good care of yourself.
Comic Artist's Essential Photo Reference, People and Poses by Buddy Scalera is published by Impact. Coming up, Stephen Bissette talks photo reference, why it sometimes looks stiff, problems that can arise from casting celebrities in your comic, and what actress was the model for Abby in Swamp Thing. If you're planning on buying some of Buddy Scalera's photo reference books, or hey, maybe an Alan Moore Stephen Bissette Swamp Thing trade, or our own Paul Young's book, Frank Miller's Daredevil and the Ends of Heroism, you can help support this podcast by ordering them through deconstructingcomics.com/Amazon. When you do so, we get a cut of Amazon's profit, which helps us cover web hosting and the other costs of assembling this show every week.
This is an imaginary podcast, which may never have happened.
The Shortbox Showcase.
But then again may have. About a father and daughter. I'm Professor Allen.
And I'm Emily.
Who came from Ohio and talked about comics.
Walking Dead.
Tintin.
Black Lightning.
White Tiger. It tells of their rise to glory, when the great guests were yet to be booked.
Let's put it this way, Shogun Warriors wasn't going to win any Eisners.
And the great feats of editing not yet performed.
This is Ultra 7, this is Ultraman Jack, and this Ultraman Taro, and this Ultraman Leo, and this
of how they spoke at length.
This continuity is really the brainchild of nitpicking nerds the world over.
But to be fair, the best kind of confession is the Force confession.
And reviewed in brief tales that explore creatively the bounds of a given character's history.
Red Sun is wonderful with a very strange ending.
Of brilliant creators before their fall from grace. This is the era where Miller is at the height of his creative and artistic powers, and the ability of strong writing to encapsulate and transcend its time.
Flash of Two Earths by Gardner Fox.
This is an imaginary podcast. Aren't they all? Shortbox Showcase is part of the Relatively Geeky family of podcasts. Check us out on the web at relativelygeekypodcast.blogspot.com or search in iTunes for Relatively Geeky or Shortbox Showcase. And remember, we're not experts.
We're just family.
Okay, it's 3 days after I talked to Buddy, and even though I went to the doctor, my throat is now worse. But I'm talking with Steve Bissette in Vermont. How are you?
Good. How are you doing, Tim? Sorry you got a rough throat. Sorry about that.
Yeah, well, we'll make sure that you have to talk a lot and I don't.
Okay, fair enough.
But yeah, I mean, after Buddy approached me about his book coming out, I thought, we see a lot of photo reference in various comics, and sometimes it's so glaringly obvious because it looks so static. It looks like statues that are posed in a fight scene.
Right.
So, what are some problems with photo reference? So one is being too stiff, and why does that happen? Because, I'm not quite sure why sometimes art looks stiff and sometimes it doesn't. What's the difference there?
If we're speaking specifically about photo reference as the starting point of the conversation, what tends to happen is artists, whether they're illustrators using photographs as a reference point for their illustrations for, magazines, illustrations for books, what have you, or if you were talking about a cartoonist using photo reference to aid and abet the creation of a comic narrative, it really comes down to too slavish a devotion to what looks representationally real in the photograph being carried over into the drawings. Cartoonists have been using photo reference, ever since there's been photographs. And you've got certain schools of cartooning where, and I'm thinking specifically of the Flegels at EC Comics, artists like Al Williamson, Frank Frazetta, Roy Krenkel, and so on. They used photo reference. Al Williamson had quite a swipe file. I got to know Al Williamson a bit in my younger years, and my friend Rick Veitch actually worked with Al Williamson on a number of projects, including the Empire Strikes Back comic adaptation that Marvel Comics published, the adaptation of the Dino De Laurentiis Flash Gordon movie. These were all Al Williamson projects that Rick worked on. Al needed photo reference to do his work, and he'd been using photo reference since the EC days. You look at his westerns and his science fiction comics from that era, and you can recognize Buster Crabbe again and again and again, the actor who played Flash Gordon. Buster Crabbe was one of Al's heroes, and he would cast Buster Crabbe in his comics, and he was definitely working from photographs. The difference is Al had a really seductive ink line. He would use the reference photos for his penciling and then not look at them and do the inking by hand. And Al had a very distinctive inking style, making the images his own. And there's a whole school of artists that I would tend to link with Al Williamson who worked in comic books, including Doug Wildey, my classmate from the Kubert School and still friend, Tom Yates. There's a certain tribe of adventure cartoonists who are very consciously working in that Al Williamson school, and they're emulating that use of photo reference in order to bring a very lush, lavish, illustrative style to their work. Then you've got cartoonists like Gene Colan. Gene Colan used photo reference a great deal. But what Gene did that was different from what anybody else was doing is Gene tended to not embrace the static look of photographs, the feeling of frozen time. He tended to experiment with what happens when you blur those images. And he was perhaps working from how movement is blurred when it's captured in news photography and journalistic photography. And that's an aspect of working from photo reference that I embraced in my own work. Even when I was working with John Tottleman as inker, I really was looking for that approach. So there's two different schools there. And I think the problem is when people just go with copying photographs too slavishly, that you get that static, frozen work that that I hear you reacting to with your question.
Yeah. Looking around, I found the blog of, I'm not sure how to pronounce her name, Karen Smith, who's the wife of Ty Templeton. She did a post about photo reference several years ago, and she mentioned that Ty used a lot of photo reference, even sometimes for drawing The Simpsons, but just to get an idea of the pose, and then would draw Simpsons anatomy. So you wouldn't guess that it was photo referenced because it doesn't look, as you say, slavishly, exactly like the photo. It's just getting the pose. Right.
Well, and animators work that way as well. I mean, we all recognize rotoscoping in classic animation, even where it was denied that they were rotoscoping, tracing figures in movement from film frames. Films like Snow White, for decades, the Disney studio denied they'd rotoscoped. Well, now we know they rotoscoped. But you had animators like Bill Titla, who is best known in the animation field for having been the animator of the character of Stromboli in Pinocchio, or the demon in The Night on Bald Mountain of Fantasia. Bill Titla was one of the animators that would use photo reference or watched filmed actors, but then he made it his own when he drew it. You can recognize a Bill Titla character animation from that classic period of Disney because his own personality went into the drawing in a way that divorced it from that kind of slavish tracing that is so obvious, in Ralph Bakshi's Lord of the Rings from the 1970s, for instance. Same goes in comics. I mean, if Ty Templeton's using photo reference just to make sure he's getting the feel of a figure, that's an approach to using photo reference that animators and Bigfoot cartoonists, the classic funny animal artists, he's using it in the way that those cartoonists would have and did. You know, I've used photo reference a lot in my career at different times, and sometimes I'm using it because I'm trying to render an object or an environment or a specific costume or something like that, and I need that visual reference to make it accurate. Mm-hmm. I'm trying to think of examples, Tim, where, you know, one of the really celebrated stories by Russ Heath that my generation of cartoonists, I remember, you know, Rick Veitch and Tom Yates really being obsessed with some of Russ Heath's work. And there was a story he had done in Blazing Combat that was scripted by Archie Goodwin. And it was a World War II story that involved a group of American soldiers, and one of them has rescued a really rare bottle of wine from some chateau in France that was abandoned as they were moving through. Heath photographed himself and played all the characters. But he drew the face of all the characters as himself. So what it actually did was obfuscate the storytelling because they all look like the same guy. Okay, and that's a case that comes to mind where it's like, oh, come on, you know. And it's a beautifully done piece of work, and it reads very well, in part because Archie's script is so compelling, and Heath is a great storyteller. The panel-to-panel, tier-to-tier, page-to-page story flow is great. But all the characters look like Russ Heath, you know? It's sort of like, you know, in that sequence in Being John Malkovich where everyone is John Malkovich, you know? And that, to me, is a classic case of a cartoonist going too far with photo reference, you know? He didn't even add, like, a mustache or anything or change the hairline or, you know, they're all Russ Heath. However, the same artist, I mean, Russ Heath used photo reference all the time. In his Sergeant Rock comics and a lot of the great work that he did with other publishers. And, you know, the characters were very distinct, apart from one another. The work looked rich and alive in a way that Blazing Combat story was kind of dead because of the fact that all those characters were Russ Heath. He was, you know, working from his own photos. So, you know, even artists that have demonstrated a real skill in adapting photo reference to their own needs, you know, you can find examples of where they just cling to it too much. And I'm sure the same is true of my body of work at some point in time.
Okay, so yeah, stiffness is one problem I noticed. Another one is, well, some years ago when we talked a little bit on the podcast about the comic series Ex Machina, the artist was Tony Harris, and Mulele, who's on the show often, co-founder, mentioned that looking through an issue of Ex Machina, it's clear that it's photo reference because the point of view is kind of always the same. You're always at kind of the same eye level as the characters and about the same distance, and the angles are not played with it. You know,
okay, yeah, and that makes sense too. You know, it's kind of like you look at early silent film in the history of cinema, where they would tend to set up the camera in the position of the best seat in the house in a theater, and the screen then becomes, you know, the stage, and it has this very static tableau-like feel where the characters are always the same distance from the camera lens. We never get close-ups and so on. Yeah, I think the same definitely can apply to comics that are too devoted to their photo reference. On the other hand, photo reference can really be liberating, you know? I mean, I can think of a number of examples of comics where I know that photo reference had been used, but it's used in a wonderful way. And really brings environments or props that are in the story to life because the rendering is so accurate and crystal clear. The clarity becomes really rich and resonant. And, you know, it can go either way. I tend to recognize photo reference when it's being used incorrectly in a lot of current comics that are coming out of the Marvel stable, and sometimes in the DC stable, where it's obvious that they're using digital tools to adapt photo reference.
Mm-hmm.
And it just looks like a badly solarized Fumetti or something.
yeah. Like Iron Man recently has been like that.
Yeah, but I first was seeing it like 10 years ago, Tim. I think it was a Fantastic Four comic where it was. There are some cartoonists these days that have this wonderful precision of line, and their characters are beautifully drawn in a very crisp representational style. But you can tell when they're just working from a specific cast of actors and a too devotional attention to emulating every aspect of the photograph, and there's no life left in the drawing. There's some artists whose work I really love, like P. Craig Russell. P. Craig, sometimes I can recognize he's using the same model from story to story or opera adaptation to opera adaptation. But when P. Craig Russell is inking the work, he brings a whole nother level to the drawing, and he also has gotten away from that quality you mentioned a couple minutes ago, where the camera is always the same distance from the subject or always the same eye line or so on. But on the other hand, I think sometimes that works in P. Craig Russell's work because he is often adapting opera, and he wants to have that theatricality as part of the visual tapestry that he's weaving. I can think of lots of examples where it's pluses and minuses, but I could also say the same about reference from illustration work. I'm obsessed with dinosaurs, Tim, as you well know. I can recognize periods of time in comics history, comic books and comic strips, where certain classic pop paleontology books were the only references that certain eras of cartoonists were looking at. It's almost like there's a Charles R. Knight period of dinosaur comics where everybody's copying the same group of Charles R. Knight reconstructions of prehistoric life. There's another period where everybody's working from the same Sinclair Oil dinosaur book that was available for a generation for free. And it's funny sometimes, some of those artists, I mentioned Gene Colan earlier, Gene Colan uses the same dinosaur reference book, in a story that he did for DC in the mid-'60s, in a story he did for Creepy or Eerie in the mid-'60s. It's like, it makes me wish that I could go back in time and just hand Gene Colan 2 other reference books to work from. I also can recognize when people are using toys or model kits as their reference. Okay, and sometimes it's in works that you wouldn't necessarily think that's what the artist is using, but you take a look at a certain sequence in Frank Miller's Sin City, and he's working with a model of a certain make of car, and I could tell you what model kit it was that he was working from. Russ Heath would build model kits of some of the World War II tanks that he was drawing for the Haunted Tank or Sergeant Rock for DC Comics. But Heath would vary his point of view and use the model kit so that he could actually, almost crawl under the tank to get those difficult shots when you're looking up at the turret and so on. And in that case, I think using a model kit's a real boon, where the cartoonist is really pushing, working with the model so that they're able to simulate the point of view from different eye lines, whether you're above, looking down in an omniscient third-person, godlike point of view, or you're down in the trenches looking up at a tank tread that's about to come up over your head. I mentioned in our Facebook exchanges earlier, there was an artist whose work I was attracted to for a time in the Warren publications in the early 80s, a woman named Val Lakey, who also signed her work Artifact. and I wasn't able to lay hands on my copy of the issue. But I mean, she did some pretty terrific work in Vampirella and Eerie and Creepy. But her use of photo reference and her close, often pencil or charcoal renderings to catch all the tonalities tended to make her comic pages a little prosaic at times. But the point where it was really a liability is she did a story for one of those Warren books that involved a little monster. And it was so obvious that she had sculpted or had somebody sculpt a model. And even though she was varying her point of view and the lighting and so on, the creature remained absolutely static. Its arm never moves, its mouth never moves. And, you know, I've seen some very good cartoonists do the same sort of thing, and it gets annoying when you realize that you're looking at characters who never open their mouths, never, you know, change their expression, because the cartoonist is working from a rigid, you know, model of that character that they've sculpted or photographed or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Speaking of using celebrities in your photo reference, just happened to be listening to iFanboy podcast yesterday. They were talking about how they were reading Iron Man and happened to notice Ned Beatty as, you know, kind of cast in the story, and it was kind of distracting to them. They said it takes them out of it to, you know, suddenly.
Yeah, some people have that issue. I mean, I remember I was a fan of Paul Gulacy's run on Master of Kung Fu when Doug Mensch was the long-term writer on that series in the 70s, and Gulacy, early in his career, you know, Shang-Chi, the son of Fu Manchu, who's the protagonist of Master of Kung Fu, published by Marvel Comics, is, you know, is this sort of nondescript character initially. Jim Starlin was the original artist on the series, if memory serves. And you could tell right in the series when Gulacy had fallen in love with Bruce Lee's films. And suddenly Shang-Chi changes, you know, looks nothing like the character Jim Starlin was drawing, and becomes Bruce Lee. And it was a matter of an issue or two where, you know, Paul Gulacy's pencils were really being transformed by his obsession with Bruce Lee being not just a role model for the character, but the physical model for the character. And then gradually Gulacy developed that into Sean Connery played a character in the strip, and Marlon Brando played a character in the strip, you know? And I loved that aspect of seeing Gulacy's work, you know, change and develop, and because I was a movie lover, I went with the flow. But I remember friends who were getting pissed off at the comic because they're like, you know, this is obtrusive to me. I don't want Marlon Brando appearing in my Marvel comic. And it was something Gulacy stuck with. He later did a pretty terrific 3-part story called The Trespasser for Eerie. It was written by Don McGregor, and the hero is James Coburn. And it is James Coburn, you know? And I can see, I mean, I can see where people would look at that and have that yank them out of the comic, which is what it sounds like your friend was saying with that particular run of that series that you mentioned. But in some cases, it's something that the artist really embraced. It was something I did on Swamp Thing, you know. If you look back at that, the first few issues that we did with Alan Moore, that's Peter Cushing as Jason Woodrue. You know, I mean, I cast Peter Cushing, who played Dr. Frankenstein in the old Hammer films, as Jason Woodrue. There were a few reasons I did that. In part, when I was first beginning to sell work professionally, and I was running around the countryside with my portfolio, I was fortunate enough to have an overnight stay with one of the Golden Age cartoonists who was living by that time in Vermont, Vincent Fago. And Vincent looked at my folio and said, your characters are not consistent panel to panel. And we had dinner together at his house before he brought me into his studio and looked through my folio. And he said, you know, at dinner we were talking about movies. He says, if you love movies, cast your characters. Teach yourself how to consistently draw the same character from panel to panel and have them be themselves by working with casting your characters, getting the photo reference you need, and teach yourself that skill. And I did, and it was an effective way of teaching myself that skill set. And it would take my drawing, 3 to 4 issues of a book like Swamp Thing with a character like Abby, Abigail Cable, where I needed photo reference of a certain actress for the first few issues, and then I could draw her out of my head. By then, Abby had become Abby, and I didn't need to rely on photo reference to be able to draw that character. In my case, it was less evident to most readers because John Tottleben was inking my pencils, and John's own style of inking is very different from the way I ink my work, and John was transforming my drawing in such a way with Abby. John had a much stronger sense of Abby as a character, and those cues that you would recognize from the photo reference I worked from was essentially obliterated by John's inks, and that was to the better, right? You wouldn't look at those early issues and go, "Oh, that's Sigourney Weaver," because John's inks made Abby Abby. And that became a back and forth process, Tim, where I was learning how to draw Abby in part from also looking at how John inked my pencils, and we arrived within about 3 issues at a very consistent approach to the character of Abby. But sometimes photo reference is useful in that regard. I'm going to cast a character. It's going to be this person. That will be unrecognizable to you if I'm casting a friend of mine, someone you would never know, as opposed to if I'm drawing from photos of, Taylor Swift or Brad Pitt or something, where you're going to look at them and go, "Oh, that's, so-and-so," because it's a public celebrity that I'm working from.
Yeah. Now, is there any issue with if you find like some photos online and copy them for your comic, is there a potential problem with the copyright?
There sure is. Yeah, you got to be careful with that stuff. The classic example that you may remember from your boyhood is the character of Clea from Doctor Strange. One of the brilliant artists who was drawing Doctor Strange during a stretch of time, and I think this was in the early 80s, used the likeness of a popular Christian singer and drew from a photo on one of her record albums to do a Doctor Strange cover, and used this Christian folk singer's likeness as Clea. And she recognized herself, this Christian folk singer, and she sued Marvel because she had no interest in being misrepresented as an occult character in a comic that involved black magic, because this was an outrage to her. This was an assault on her religious beliefs. She was a very devout Christian. So yeah, I can bounce back on you in a number of ways. I can't think of any examples right off the top of my head, but I'm sure that there have been problems for some cartoonists using too easily recognized photo reference. My advice to my students when they're and we do urge our students at the Center for Cartoon Studies to do your research. If you have to draw a portion of a story, or you're doing a graphic novel that is set in some part of the world you've never been, you are very reliant on photo reference and what may be available out there. This is nothing new. Cartoonists have kept swipe files for generations. I remember when Joe Kubert telling me that when Carmen Infantino became the publisher at DC Comics, that he let all his friends know that he was never going to draw a comic again. He was a publisher now. And anything they wanted from Carmen's studio, they could come get. And Joe said Carmen's photo swipe files were very desirable. So, my advice to my students to avoid the problem you're raising, are there legal problems if you use photo reference that's too easily recognizable? I always say, if you're using Google or some search engine, don't pick the first photos that are on the first page. Dig deeper, find some photo reference. If you're going to be working from a specific research tool, credit it somewhere in your book or in the story or in the indicia or a thank you at the end of the story. Acknowledge where you got it from. I've never been shy about doing that. I'll put thank yous at the end of a story or even at the bottom of a page in some cases. In the old days, publishers, editors would wipe that stuff out. In the current enlightened era we're in, people expect to see appendices and footnotes at the end of graphic novels, and that's where you would acknowledge your source. Usually that takes care of the problem, Tim, because if you're at least acknowledging, I referenced these National Geographic issues or this photographer's work, okay, they're happy, they got acknowledged. Hergé used photo reference to draw Tintin. I mean, he didn't leave his studio in Belgium until much later in his life, when he actually had time and money to travel with. He wouldn't have made any of his deadlines if he had set foot out of his studio, where he was essentially locked up every day. Use of photo reference goes back to as I said at the top of the conversation, the beginning of the art form, the beginning of the industry. Cartoonists have always used photo reference. So copyright, yeah, it can be a real issue. You could invite legal trouble, specifically if you're using the likenesses of individuals, even if they're public figures. Now, it's one thing if, as Tom Yates did, and we continued it in Swamp Thing, you're casting a public political figure as a character. Those characters, once they become public figures, specifically in the political arena, they're fair game. Richard Nixon cannot go suing every cartoonist that was using the likeness of Richard Nixon. And it's one thing to expect to see Donald Trump appear in editorial cartoons, but there's a Doonesbury collection that just came out. It's 30 years of Donald Trump cartoons in Doonesbury. Gary Trudeau does not owe any money or any permissions to Donald Trump to do that. Trump is a very public figure, and once you move into those arenas of public life, you're fair game. On the other hand, let's say I was to create a character and I make him look exactly like Boris Karloff. Well, I better clear permission with Sarah Karloff, because many of these families now, and the laws in California changed in the late 70s, early 80s, where the heirs of public figures who are in the motion picture or entertainment industry do own the likeness of their star parents and are very protective of that. If you're going to cast Bela Lugosi as anything other than a character that appears on a few pages or a few panels, you better contact Lugosi's son and actually arrange for the rights clearances. I go so far as I got to do a photo session for one story that I'm hoping to draw in the coming years, and I did an entire photo session at Dartmouth College with a number of Dartmouth students and local area students playing characters. I paid them for their time, and I got them all to sign model releases, giving me permission to use their likeness. And I imagine P. Craig Russell has long taken the same precaution with his work, because he has been using models who've been photographed, in his work since the 80s. So, so if you're concerned with the legality, then deal with it. Either deal with it or avoid it. On the other hand, Tim, I am one of the two guys, me and John Tottleman, who started drawing Sting in the background of Swamp Thing, and that became John Constantine.
Yes. I was just thinking about
that. And as far as I know, that's never been a legal issue. But, we've never been mum either about, that's where John Constantine came from. So.
Yeah, well, I have a feeling Sting probably wouldn't mind.
Well, we hope not, but I remember when there was a stink, no pun intended, over the casting of the feature film. And when it was announced it was Keanu Reeves, you know, a lot of people were upset. And I thought, well, that's smart. You know, Keanu Reeves is as far as you can get from the likeness of Gordon Sumner as possible, you know? He looks nothing like Sting. Same, different build, different face, different hair color. In a way, that solved a lot of problems for Warner Brothers at that point. So,
I see. Okay. Well, any final words, like how should people go about using photo reference?
Well, as I say, I use it in my work, and that goes everywhere from, you know, using photographs of moss-covered northwestern North American forests as reference when I was drawing Tyrant, you know, my dinosaur comic, up to literally casting individual characters in some of the comic work I've done over the years. And I'll go back to, you know, my take on Jason Woodrue, the Floronic Man, was I cast Peter Cushing in that role. I think it's a strength, not a liability, when it's used well. And I also think, as I would urge any artist to do, whatever you're working from, transform it into your own work. You know, do make it your own. And when I say make it your own, I don't mean get delusional and pretend that's your photo or your face. I mean, you know, transform it in the drawing process and really make that character your own. The one place where photo reference is absolutely essential and necessary, Tim, is if you're doing journalistic comics or history-based comics, whether they're nonfiction or fiction. If you're going to have Abraham Lincoln as a character, do your homework, do your research, choose the images you're going to use as your reference points, and really make that character live on the page when you're drawing them. So there are certain genres and certain types of stories or graphic novel projects where photo reference is absolutely essential. You've got to make it your own.
As you may have guessed, the Christian singer that Steve referred to was Amy Grant. I looked it up and found that she was actually cast as Morgana Blessing on the cover of Doctor Strange 15, dated March 1990. I'll link to the Comic Book Resources article about it from the show notes, and to a few of the other things Steve and I talked about. Deconstructing Comics is on Twitter, Tumblr, Facebook, Patreon, and YouTube. All our social media links can be found on the right sidebar at deconstructingcomics.com. Also, please give us a review on iTunes or Stitcher. If you're interested in sponsoring this podcast or sending some feedback, write to mail@deconstructingcomics.com. Our theme is from bensound.com. Last Thursday on To the Bat Polls, Paul and I looked at Adam West's autobiography, Back to the Batcave, including his approach to the show, his misunderstanding of the word camp, and just how trustworthy some of his recollection really is. Or is it spin? Look up To the Bat Polls wherever you find your podcasts, or at tothebatpolls.libsyn.com. Then next Monday on this podcast, Kumar is joined by Ryan Cecil Smith to talk about the recently published edition of Leiji Matsumoto's Queen Emeraldus, Volume 1. Till then, this is Tim, and thanks for listening to Deconstructing Comics.